The fog rolled in from the sea like a silent army, swallowing the cliffs and the narrow lanes of the small Cornish village of Trevelyan. From the window of Rosehill Cottage, Agnes Marlowe could barely see the outline of the old oak tree that marked the edge of her garden. The world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the whisper of the waves and the faint creak of the cottage walls. It had been almost 2 years since her husband, Thomas, was lost to the sea. The villagers said the storm that night was the worst in decades. The coastguards never found his body, only the remains of his fishing boat tangled in seaweed near Blackstone Cove. Yet Agnes refused to believe that the sea had truly taken him. Every morning, she wrote him a letter. She never said goodbye, only until tomorrow. Each note went into the rusted red post box at the end of Rosehill Lane, its paint peeling and its lock broken. She liked to imagine the sea breeze carrying her words out to him, wherever he was. That afternoon, as she was about to post her latest letter, the fog grew thicker. The air tasted of salt and iron. She felt a chill crawl up her arms as she pushed the letter through the slot. It clinked softly inside, joining the emptiness within. But when she turned to leave, she noticed something strange. There was already an envelope inside the box. It was old, yellowed around the edges, with her name written in a hand she would have recognized anywhere. Agnes Marlowe. The ink was smudged, as though written in haste, but the message inside was clear. I am still here. Do not sell the house. Her breath caught in her throat. The handwriting was Thomas's, every curve, every flick of the pen exactly as she remembered. Her knees weakened as she clutched the letter to her chest, the fog closing in until she could no longer tell where the land ended and the sea began. And somewhere, faintly, from the cliffs beyond the cottage, came the sound of footsteps on gravel. The next morning arrived grey and heavy, the air still thick with the ghost of last night's fog. Agnes hadn't slept. The letter lay open on her bedside table, its words staring back at her in the pale dawn light. She had read it at least 20 times. Each time, her heart fought between fear and hope. She wanted to believe it was Thomas, but the rational part of her whispered that it was impossible. Perhaps some cruel villager had played a trick, she thought. Yet who would know his handwriting so perfectly? Outside, the sea roared like a living thing. She dressed quickly, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped into the cold morning air. The path to the cliffs was slick with dew. Every stone, every bend, held a memory of Thomas, his laughter as he mended his nets, his boots by the door, his voice calling her name over the wind. When she reached the edge of the cliffs, she froze. Down below, on the narrow strip of shore where the tide met the rocks, a man was standing. His figure was blurred by mist, but his stance, the way he held his shoulders, the tilt of his head, felt achingly familiar. Thomas. The name tore from her throat before she could stop it. The figure turned slightly. For a fleeting moment, she thought he heard her. Then, as the wind howled, the sea surged forward, and he was gone, vanished into the fog as if swallowed by the ocean itself. Agnes stumbled down the narrow path toward the beach, heart hammering, her boots slipping on wet stone. When she reached the shore, there was no sign of anyone. Only the waves crashed against the rocks, and a single footprint remained in the sand before the tide erased it completely. As she stood there, catching her breath, she noticed something glinting between 2 stones. She knelt and picked it up, a silver wedding ring. Inside the band was engraved a phrase she knew by heart. Always come home. Her eyes filled with tears. That was Thomas's promise on their wedding day. But he had been buried with that very ring. She had seen it on his cold hand inside the coffin before it was lowered into the earth. Her hands trembled as she clutched the ring. Then, from behind her, carried faintly on the wind, came a voice. Agnes. It was not the sea. It was not her imagination. It was him. And when she turned around, there were footprints leading up the shore, fresh ones, too large to be her own. That night, Rosehill Cottage did not feel like home. The walls creaked louder than usual, the wind seemed to whisper words she could almost understand, and every candle she lit flickered as if disturbed by unseen breath. Agnes sat by the hearth, clutching the silver ring in her palm. She had cleaned it earlier, though part of her wished she hadn't. Now that it gleamed under the firelight, it felt real, too real. She could not forget the sound of that voice on the shore. It had been Thomas's voice. Not a dream, not a trick of the wind. She had heard him as clearly as she had heard him the night before he went out to sea for the last time. Unable to rest, she rose and went to the window. Outside, the garden was pale under the half-moon. The sea, beyond the trees, shimmered faintly with silver light. And then she saw it, something she could not explain. In the upper window of the cottage, the one that used to be Thomas's study, a light flickered. It was soft, golden, and unmistakably real. Her heart thudded. That room had been locked since his death. She had sealed it herself, unable to face his books, his coat still hanging behind the chair, the smell of salt and tobacco that had never quite faded. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step groaning beneath her weight. The air grew colder as she neared the door. The faint glow seeped through the keyhole like a living thing. She hesitated, holding her breath, then turned the handle. The door opened with a soft creak. The room was just as she remembered, only now, a candle burned on the desk. Wax dripped down its side, pulling on a stack of papers she did not recall leaving there. And on the desk lay another letter. Her name written across it in the same, familiar hand. She reached out with trembling fingers and opened it. "You must leave before the sea takes you too." The words blurred as her eyes filled with tears. She stumbled back, her mind spinning. The firelight flickered against the window, and in its reflection she saw something move behind her. A shadow, a tall figure standing in the doorway. "Thomas," she whispered. But when she turned, there was no one there. Only the faint scent of salt on the air, and the sound of the sea growing louder, as if the tide itself had drawn closer to the house. The storm arrived without warning. By dawn, the wind howled like a wounded beast, slamming rain against the windows and shaking the shutters. Rosehill Cottage groaned under its fury. Agnes stood by the kitchen door, staring out at the dark sea that seemed to heave and twist as though alive. The words from the letter echoed in her mind. "You must leave before the sea takes you too." But leave? This house was all she had left of Thomas. Every stone, every creak in the floorboards, carried his memory. To abandon it felt like betraying him. Yet something deep within her whispered that the warning was real. As she prepared tea with trembling hands, she noticed water seeping under the door. The storm tide was higher than she had ever seen. She rushed to the window and gasped. The path leading down to the cove was nearly gone, swallowed by the waves. Then she saw it again. A figure on the rocks. Through sheets of rain, a man stood where no one could stand and live. The waves crashed violently around him, yet he did not move. His coat, dark and soaked, whipped in the wind, and even from this distance she could see the glint of silver on his hand. "Thomas," she screamed, her voice lost in the roar of the storm. Without thinking, she snatched her lantern and ran outside. The wind tore at her shawl, rain lashed her face, but she kept going, her boots sinking into mud and seawater. The lantern flickered wildly as she stumbled down toward the cliff path. "Thomas, wait!" she cried again. The closer she came, the colder the air grew. The storm's sound seemed to fade until all she could hear was the rush of her own heartbeat. When she reached the edge, she stopped short. The figure was gone. Only the sea remained, boiling and endless. Her lantern blew out. Darkness fell, thick and absolute. Then, faintly, above the wind, came a sound that froze her blood. The creak of a door. From the direction of her cottage. She turned back, breath catching in her throat. Through the rain, she saw her front door swinging open, though she was certain she had locked it before leaving. A dim light pulsed from inside, flickering like a heartbeat. And for the briefest moment, in the window of the study, she saw him again. Thomas, his face pale, his eyes dark with sorrow, raising a hand as though trying to warn her away. By the time Agnes reached the cottage, her dress was soaked through and her hair clung to her face. The storm raged behind her as she forced the door shut, her breath coming in gasps. The light she had seen from outside still flickered upstairs, seeping through the cracks of Thomas's study door. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest. Every instinct told her to run, to leave the house and never look back. Yet something stronger, curiosity, love, or madness, kept her rooted to the spot. She took a deep breath and climbed the stairs, her hand gripping the banister for balance. When she reached the top, the door to the study was ajar. The candle she had seen earlier burned low, its flame trembling as though aware of her presence. The air was damp and smelled faintly of salt. On the desk lay Thomas's old leather-bound journal. She had searched for it months ago, but it had vanished after his death. Now it sat there as if it had never been gone. Her fingers brushed the cover. It was cold, unnaturally cold. Slowly, she opened it. The first few pages were filled with his handwriting, neat and steady. Notes about fishing routes, tides, and the boats he repaired. But then, halfway through, the tone changed. The writing became hurried, almost desperate. The sea is not what it seems. There is something beneath the cove. It calls to me at night. Agnes frowned, flipping to the next page. I hear her voice when the tide is high. She promises calm waters, if I only listen. And beneath those words, a final entry written the night before he died. If anything happens to me, tell Agnes not to trust the waves. The sea remembers its own. Her hand flew to her mouth. A gust of wind burst through the window, scattering loose pages across the room. The candle went out, plunging her into darkness. Then, in the dim glow of lightning, she saw movement, a figure standing beside the desk. Thomas. His skin pale as moonlight, his eyes hollow yet filled with longing. He raised his hand slowly, as if reaching for her. Thomas, her voice trembled. He didn't speak. Instead, he pointed to the journal, his expression grave, almost pleading. Then the sound of the sea roared through the open window, deafening, wild, and she felt a pull, as though something invisible was dragging her towards it. When the lightning flashed again, he was gone. Only the journal remained open on the desk, and a wet handprint marked the page where he had last written. The wind howled that night, rattling the shutters and sending sprays of salt against the windowpane. Agnes sat before the fire, her hands trembling as she clutched the final letter she had received. The writing was unmistakable, Henry's hand, neat and strong, yet the paper was damp with seawater, as if it had traveled from the deep itself. The message was brief: meet me by the lighthouse. Midnight. Alone. Her heart pounded. Fear battled with longing inside her chest. The sensible part of her screamed that it was madness, that she was walking into the unknown. Yet a deeper voice whispered that she had to know the truth. She threw on her thick wool coat, lit her lantern, and stepped into the storm. The path towards the cliffs was treacherous, slick with rain and seaweed. The ocean roared beneath her like a living beast, its waves clawing at the rocks. The beam of the lighthouse swung across the darkness, lighting her way in broken intervals. As she neared the top, she saw a figure standing by the rail, tall, motionless, facing the sea. Henry. Her voice broke against the wind. The figure turned. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. It was him, his outline, his coat, the familiar tilt of his head. Yet his face was pale, his eyes distant, reflecting no life. He lifted his hand slowly, as though greeting her from another world. I waited, he whispered, his voice thin as the mist. But you must let me go. The lantern flickered violently, casting shadows that danced across the rocks. Agnes stepped forward, desperate to reach him, but as lightning split the sky, the figure dissolved into the rain. The lantern dropped from her hand, shattering on the ground. In its brief glow, she saw something glint among the stones, a gold wedding ring. She fell to her knees, clutching it tight. "I'll never forget you," she sobbed, as the waves crashed far below. But through her tears, she noticed the light from the lighthouse had changed. It was steady now, calm, as though watching over her. By dawn, the storm had passed. The sea was quiet, and the air carried a strange peace. Agnes stood at the cliff's edge, staring at the horizon. The ring still lay warm in her palm. Though her heart ached, she understood. Henry was gone, but his love had led her to the truth, and the light would always guide her home. Several weeks passed after the night at the lighthouse, yet the memory lingered like sea mist over Rosehill Cottage. Agnes tried to return to her writing, but the ink refused to flow, and her thoughts drifted endlessly to that moment when Henry's voice had broken through the storm. Though she had accepted his farewell, something in her heart whispered that his story was not yet over. One morning, while tidying the sitting room, she noticed the rug near the hearth had curled at the edge. As she lifted it to straighten it, the corner of an old wooden board caught her finger. Beneath the worn grain, she saw faint markings, initials carved into the wood. H, M, and A, M, intertwined within a heart. Her breath hitched. She remembered Henry carving it on their first night at Rosehill. But as she looked closer, she saw a newer inscription below, almost hidden, "Forgive me." A chill ran through her. The carving hadn't been there before. She fetched a candle and gently pried the board loose. Inside was a small wooden box wrapped in oilcloth, smelling faintly of salt. Within it lay a collection of letters, photographs, and a weathered compass, the same compass Henry had carried on every voyage. But one of the letters was addressed not to her, but to a woman named Margaret Blythe. With trembling hands, Agnes opened it. The letter began with Henry's handwriting. "My dearest Margaret, by the time you read this, you will know why I could never return. What happened off the coast was not an accident. If anything happens to me, tell Agnes the truth. Tell her I never meant to betray her." Her heart thudded painfully. The air in the room grew heavier, the shadows deeper. Who was Margaret Blythe? And what did Henry mean by betrayal? She searched the remaining letters, maps, notes, receipts from a shipping company in Plymouth. There was something else too, a small photograph of Henry standing beside a woman with dark hair and kind eyes. Suddenly, the wind outside rose, slamming the shutters. The candle flickered, and she thought she heard faint footsteps upstairs. Slowly, Agnes turned her head toward the staircase. The footsteps stopped. Then, a soft whisper floated down the corridor. "Find her, before they do." The voice was Henry's. Agnes clutched the compass to her chest, her pulse racing. The truth she had longed for was closer than ever, but so was the danger that had claimed her husband's life. Agnes knew she could not stay any longer. The letters, the photographs, the compass, they all pointed to a secret she had never imagined. Margaret Blythe had been part of Henry's past, a past that seemed to reach across the tides and years to haunt her. Yet the urgency in his voice, the warning, left her no choice but to follow the trail. She packed a small bag, taking only essentials, the compass, the letters, a thick coat, and a lantern. The morning fog hugged Rosehill Cottage as she stepped outside, the sea stretching vast and grey before her. Her heart raced, but she felt strangely calm. She was following him one last time, hoping to uncover the truth. The path to Plymouth was long, winding through cliffs and narrow coves. Every step seemed guided by the memory of Henry, as if he had left invisible markers for her to follow. By dusk, she reached an abandoned warehouse near the harbour. Its windows were shattered, doors creaked with every gust of wind, and the smell of salt and old wood filled the air. Inside, she found a small rowboat tied to the dock. A single lantern hung from a post, illuminating the water. The letters had indicated this was the place, the crossing. She untied the boat and pushed off, her hands gripping the oars as the water lapped against the hull. The wind carried her forward, whispering secrets she could almost understand. Halfway across the harbor, the lantern flickered and a voice carried over the waves. Agnes. She froze. There, standing on the far pier, was Henry. His eyes were full of sorrow and longing, his coat drenched but his stance steady. You should not have come, he said softly. But now that you are here, you must see the truth. Agnes rowed closer, every stroke a battle against the tide. The closer she got, the more the storm seemed to retreat. When she finally reached him, he took her hands in his. The sea, it hides many things, he whispered. I was never lost. I was trapped in a place between tides, between worlds. Margaret helped me survive, but I could never return, until you came. Tears streamed down Agnes's face. I thought I lost you forever. He shook his head. No. You found me. And now we can cross together. As they stepped into the boat, the lantern cast a golden glow over the water. The waves, once wild, now carried them gently. The horizon shimmered, the storm faded, and for the first time in years, Agnes felt the weight lift from her heart. Henry's hand tightened around hers, and together, they rowed toward the light beyond the cliff, the light that promised a new beginning, a reunion, and a truth finally revealed.